So today, we are going to talk about getting gifts from younger donors. And we're going to talk about millennials, which we've spoken about before. We're going to talk about Gen Z for the first time. And there's some super interesting stuff to talk about here. So please, if you have any questions, if you have any thoughts you want to add, enter that in the chat at any point. We're here. We have a lot to cover today. So I'm going to go a little bit quickly. We will send the notes and recording around after the fact. If you need, by the way, if you need to turn on closed captioning, you can. If you're hard of hearing, if you're hard of sight, I'll be describing most of the visuals. So we got you there. Couple quick housekeeping notes before we start. This event is approved for 1.0 CFRE credits. At the end of the session, we're going to drop a survey in the chat. So make a note there. And so that happens at the end, pretty straightforward and simple. Here's the agenda for today. We're going to do some very quick intros. We're going to sort of explore the generations and particularly how they're different from each other and how they're different from older generations, right? The stuff that is the differences is the really interesting parts here. We're going to talk to some of the insights about the donors, what we're learning about their giving behavior. And we're talking about some very specific tips from fundraising. A bunch of this stuff is up to the minute. We have some new tools to share with you that are totally free. So I'm excited about that. And generally just actually thrilled to be here with you. It's a beautiful day here. Having a great day already. Hope you're doing well. And I'm excited to dive in. So very quick intros. I've met a lot of you before, so sorry to do this again. My name is Patrick. I am lucky to be the co-founder and co-CEO of FreeWill alongside Jenny, who I think since we last spoke had her second child. So we're so grateful for the health and happiness of her family, feeling really happy for her. She's not sleeping a lot. She's on maternity leave. She's doing her thing. But she's out in Seattle, so if you see this woman pushing two kids around now on the streets of Seattle, give her a big hug for me, and she's doing great. So that's very exciting. Super excited to be working alongside the FreeWill team. More than $8.3 billion raised, 1,300 nonprofit partners, and more than 4 centuries of combined fundraising experience and expertise. So this team works really hard, and a lot of the research that you see here is done by my colleague Phoebe, who's on the call, but also a bunch of other folks. And together we work really hard to help nonprofits like you succeed and also have fun doing it. So that's a little bit about us. One more thing before we get rolling is we're just so grateful you're here. We're going to do one of the things that I like to do, which is give away one of my favorite books. This book is by Dr. Jean Twenge, and it's about the differences, looks at all the research between generations and what's different, what's the same, and why. So it's a really interesting book. If you want to understand your parents better, your kids better, your aunts and uncles, your younger colleagues, your older colleagues, yourself, great book. Usually we give away 20 books. This book's a bunch more expensive. It's only available in hardcover, so we're going to give away 15 today. So that's why the difference between 15 and 20. Usually these books are a little bit cheaper, so that's that. At the end of the session, we're going to drop a note in the chat for the survey. Fill that out. That's how you end up with this book. So I hope you enjoy that. I hope you get to read it. I find the sort of how history shapes generational cohorts to be really, really interesting. If you do too, you're in luck. If not, whatever. Hope you enjoy the next hour. Anyway, so a couple quick things here. How your week is going? Generally pretty well. A little bit of a dip from last week. I don't know if people see the end of summer on the horizon, but generally some good news there. Confidence in hitting our goals, roughly the same from last 2 weeks ago. A little bit of a bounce back from early end of June. Hopefully we're going to make a lot of progress here. I am actually very bullish on you all hitting your goals and general charitable giving going up this year compared to last year. So we'll talk more about why in a second, but there's a lot of factors at play that are going to make this a lot better for you. And I'm excited about that. All right, let's dive in. We're going to talk about millennials and Gen Z, one of my favorite topics. I would be curious for folks in the chat, if you don't mind, just tell us what generation you're in. Are you a Gen Zer? Are you a millennial? Are you a Gen Xer? Are you a boomer? Are you a silent generation? Maybe 1 or 2 silent folks? A bunch of geriatric millennials. Okay, very cool. A couple boomers, mix it all up. When we ask you to talk about your millennial donors, here are some of the words that show up. Engaged, passionate, cause-driven, that's a really important one. Savvy, tech-savvy, informed, loyal, inquisitive, really, really good stuff. Some folks are Zennials on the cusp of Gen X and Millennials. Not really a thing. We'll talk more about that in a second. How do we describe Gen Z donors? Obviously young. And then you see things like anxious and curious and digital, very, very tech savvy. We'll talk more about this in a second. But fundamentally grew up in a different world than even millennials, right? Those of you that are millennials like me, we're getting used to the idea that we're not the youngest adult population anymore. And that's a real curiosity for us as well. So let's talk first about millennials, not because they're more important, just we're going to talk about them first. So these folks are born between 1981 and 1996. You are about 27 to 42, or at least turning that this year, right? So that's you if you're in this age group. That's me. And there are about 73 million of us. So we are the largest generation in the United States, and we will be for a very long time. This is really important. Bigger than Gen X, bigger than Gen Z. We'll talk about that. Why is this? The boomers used to be the largest population, and millennials are the kids of boomers. So we'll show that. More than half of all Americans are millennials or younger, although the average age in the United States is higher than it has ever been in history. Let's talk about Gen Z. Very cool. New kids on the block with a lowercase. The uppercase new kids on the block are Gen X. Lowercase new kids on the block are Gen Z, born between 1997 to 2012. So this year, they are 26 to 11 years old, or 11 to 26. We are going to talk about the adults, right? You are not fundraising from 14-year-olds. If you want to, go figure that out on your own. But we're going to talk about the adult Gen Z today. And so those folks are 18 to 26. There are about 70 million Gen Zers in the United States, fewer than millennials, but still a big number. And about 58% of them are 18 plus. That's 40 million US adults. Obviously, that number of Gen Z adults is going to go up year after year after year as these kids turn 18. So generally very cool, good news there. This is a really important graph, right? So if you are a fundraiser in the United States and Canada and Australia and England, where some of you all are going to be very similar, those of you that are in the Philippines and South Africa, I know some folks from Brazil, I think Brazil are on the call, little different demographics there. What's important here? We don't have Gen Z on this map yet, but I'll show you this in a second. Millennials will be the most populous population or generation for most, if not all of your career, right? If you are 40 now and you plan to work until 2050, if you were 35 and you work until 2050, you will never be in a world where millennials are a smaller generation than another generation, right? It's not going to happen. You're really going to be waiting for 30-ish years, 35, 40 years before millennials start to pass away in reasonable numbers because we turn 70 and 80, et cetera, and Gen Z surpasses us for a brief period, right? So this is really important, right? When we think about being good at fundraising for the rest of our professional lives, fundraising well for millennials is really important. You can see where we are today in numbers, right? So you can see millennials biggest. Boomers are actually bigger than Gen X still. This is really important. Gen X is a small population. And then why is Gen Z smaller than the millennials? Because their parents are Gen X. And so you have this sort of flip-flop, right? Silent generation, not that big, obviously used to be bigger, but much smaller than boomers. Their kids were Gen X, that's why they're smaller. Gen X kids are Gen Z, that's why they're smaller. Meanwhile, greatest generation, boomers, millennials, right? That's sort of parents and grandparents. And those folks ended up being the larger generation. So you see this sort of incremental shift. Other thing to see, if you look at population by age, this is 2020. So you can see in 2020, the single largest number of people by age was about 28. It's about 31 right now, right? Obviously 3 years, those folks all got 3 years older in 3 years. And you can see how there are just more folks in the millennial range than there ever will be in Gen Z and Gen X, and you see that going forward, right? Most people wouldn't assume that there are fewer, say, 49-year-olds than 60-year-olds in America, but that is true, right? When we talk in separate sessions about planned giving, it's because this boomer population is so large and so wealthy. We'll talk about this in a moment in millennials. That's why planned giving is an absolute critical must-do for the next 1, 2, 5, 15 years of your nonprofit's life, right? Unbelievably important. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So a couple more shared facts about this generation as we dive in here. Much more educated than previous generations. So about 39% of millennials have a bachelor's degrees or higher, compared to 24% of boomers and 10 to 15% of silent generation, right? So an enormous shift. Most people don't realize that fewer than a quarter of baby boomers have bachelor's degrees, right? Because many folks tend to sort of travel in bubbles where that's more common, but this is really important, right? Gen Z, even more educated, right? At the same age, more likely to be in college compared to millennials. And so you see that more and more. Really interesting shift here. And so that's going to change the view of a lot of behavior here. Much more racially diverse than previous generations. I mean, Gen Z considerably, millennials as well. I'm going to show you more about this in a second. About 56% of American millennials are non-Hispanic white, which is just one way that demographers talk about folks. And about 51% of Gen Z is this. And Gen Z will dip below 50% by about 2026. Why is this? Immigration, right? No new Gen Z folks are being born. That cutoff is there. We're now in what we call Gen Alpha, the people that are 0 to 10 in America. But first generation, not in American history, but first generation since, say, like, 1780 or something like that. I'm not sure exactly when that would have switched. We can look at this in history and look at the sort of number of folks in the country in terms of these are folks born, right, year by year. And what we see here is you can see how radically more diverse we are by 2020 than we were in, say, even like something like 1950, where it's sort of difficult to imagine the United States being 90% white or so in the mid 40s, things like that, just sort of very, very different than what you see in modern time. And so that's a really big shift. Other shared facts, more than half of millennials are not married. Millennials who do get married are doing it later in life. Average millennial man is getting married at 30. Average woman's getting married at 28. College-educated millennials are the most likely to be married. This is a difference from some previous generations. And so far, these trends seem to hold true for older Gen Z as well. We don't really have data on younger Gen Z because a lot of them aren't even 18 yet on the stat. So that's interesting. Both millennials and Gen Z are having fewer children. They're having them later. In 2018, 55% of women between the ages of 22 and 37 had given birth, compared to 64% of boomers at that age, right? So this is a really big drop. I mean, that's like a 20% drop in births in the same period, really meaningful. And while marriage rates are higher for people with advanced degrees, birth rates are lower. And so this is a shift that's happening. Now, a lot of you have donors who are going to skew more educated. So you're going to see more folks that are married, fewer children. You're also going to see generally more single donors in this generation than you do in previous generations. Now, this is really important because single donors without kids tend to give a lot more, certainly when we get to planned giving, but even in near terms, right? Kids are really freaking expensive, as you know. And so folks without children are much more likely to be giving meaningful amounts. Other really interesting things as we go, and I know we're going through a lot quickly, but this stuff is really interesting to me, and I hope you're learning something as well. You can see that a lot of the birth rate shifts is because births by age are shifting. So I think one of the huge policy wins in America over the last 20, 30 years is the plummeting of the teen birth rate, which is sort of generally good news for a lot of different outcomes. And you can see in 2011, for 1,000 women in the age group, you were having about 32, 33 women, 3% of women who were 15, 19 were having kids. And now that's down almost by half in only a decade. If you go back previous decades, it's much higher. And so, the lack of unintended pregnancies for teens is a really big win and going to lead to lower poverty rates and higher educational attainment down the road. So that's generally good news. But also just fewer babies being born pretty radically in the United States. I mean, we're zooming out a lot more here now, right? This graph starts in 1800. And the crude birth rate is not about profanity or not about how the births happen. What it means is how many births per person, or in this case, per 1,000 people, are there in the country. And so you could see in, say, 1820, when we're peaking here, I don't actually know what happened in 1818 that really drove that up, but you could see about for every 1,000 people, there were 50 births. So 5% of the population was born that year, which is crazy. Drops down all the way down in the silent generation in the 1930s to about 2%, and we're creeping up on 1%. Now you look at why those boomers are so much bigger. Look at how many people are born in the 40s and 50s compared to the 30s and 40s. So really interesting stuff. That 30s and 40s, those are the people having Gen X kids. That dip again for Gen X, those are the people having Gen Z kids. So all this stuff sort of factors into all of American history and how it's all shaping together. Other things to note here, this is really interesting. So when millennials and Gen Z are asked for their top concerns, cost of living and inflation is a really big deal. Couple of things to note here. Why is it, more Gen Z and more millennials have preferences for living in cities, which historically have been more expensive. Housing costs are very high, right? Interesting to note that climate change is a number 2 personal concern here, personal. This is really important, right? It's really important to understand because you have older donors who are also very concerned about climate change. But the view that you hear from older donors is more, it's important for me to preserve the planet. I care about nature. I worry about species. I worry about, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all really valuable, right? That's a really noble thought. But it sounds a little bit like the way that some folks talk about national parks or the Audubon Society, really altruistic and meaningful. For millennials and Gen Z, it is a bit of that. It is also a level of personal concern, right? So if you are a Gen Zer growing up in Phoenix and most of your adult life has been record highs and you just went through a 120-degree day, you're not worried about climate change at a writ large level, although you probably are, but you're worried about it at a personal concern, the same way you worry about unemployment or the cost of living. And so the way that climate change is thought about is very different in this generation compared to previous generations, where it's also a concern, but it's never a top 2 concern. And so interesting to see that. Also Gen Z, look at number 4, mental health in my generation. That's a really big thing. Bigger concerns about unemployment than other folks as well. Other things to note here, in part by climate change, in part for other reasons, you see a really big diversity or divide between generations on their political views. So you can see silent generation, most likely in 2022, to identify as a Republican or lean Republican, and how different that is by the time you get to Gen Z, which in this graph is called plurals. I don't really know why. But you can see it's almost an inverse flip. A couple of things happening here. Folks who are urban tend to be more liberal. These generations are a little bit more urban. Folks who are more educated, on average, tend to identify more with the Democratic Party, at least in 2022. That hasn't always been true. And these folks are more in that category. Interesting to see, right? But it looks like a seesaw. One other thing that's interesting here is there is an old adage, and I'm going to get it wrong, so someone can correct me here. This basically says if you're not a liberal at 20, you have no heart, and if you're not a conservative at 40, you have no brain. And that the adage means that people tend to drift more conservative as they get older. And one of the things that we see in millennials is that trend hasn't held true. So millennials are even a little bit more liberal in 2017 than that same group was in 2004, which is sort of unexpected here. Now, silent generation drifting a little bit more conservative as well, but just interesting to watch over time how that shifts. Okay, let's talk more, and we'll dive in here a little bit more about millennials, elder versus younger. One thing that's really interesting here is the donors that we're going to focus on in our work, not in the session, but in our work, are older millennials. Why? Older folks tend to have more money, and your older millennials are going to be better donors right now than your younger donors and Gen Z. And this micro generation of older millennials is often called the Oregon Trail generation. Now, some of you are here. Wonderful game, right? Why is it called this? It's the last generation to remember life before the internet and widespread cell phones. And we all, the early internet and the early computers were so simple, right? We all had the same couple of games, right? There was Oregon Trail, there was SimCity, there was Number Munchers, there was Where in the World is Carmen San Diego, and everyone's library had the same game, and we all sort of experienced the same way before content blew up in this enormous way that Gen Z had access to, and younger millennials even. And so this sort of remembering life before the internet this is really the last cohort to do so, and it really shaped them, right? Folks are also off to college just as 9/11 happened. Remember that happened my senior year of high school. Have more of a globalist lens because of that, right? They thought more about foreign policy than folks before or after. They remember the Clinton years, they remember the Lewinsky scandals and things like that, the impeachment, but they were really shaped by the Bush and Obama years, right, in terms of their worldview. Meanwhile, younger millennials, born between 1990 and 96, so these folks are up to 33 right now, from 27. Even these folks are nearly 30, right? So our younger millennials are getting older. They've been part of the workforce for more than a decade, and their adolescence was shaped by the Great Recession post-2008, the release of the iPhone, the Obama presidency. They weren't really, they don't really remember the Clinton years. The sort of first early Bush years are a little bit of a blur, but this sort of ubiquitous technology, the iPhone comes up in 2009 when some of these folks are, not that old here, right? 19 or even 13. And so they've lived in a smartphone life for their adolescence and beyond. And that's a big shift. And then Gen Z, obviously continuing some of these trends. When we talk about the adults, these are folks born between 97 and 2002, age 26 to 21. These folks are incredibly tech savvy and grew up in a tech first world. More than 2/3 of this generation use Instagram every single day. They're vocal about issues around social justice, climate change, equity. They grew up with a 24-hour news cycle. It's difficult to overstate how much COVID and the interruption of COVID shaped their lives. And so from a young age, they spend a ton of life online and on social media. And because for a portion of that, right, during COVID, it was their only connection with a lot of people at these really crucial formative years. So that certainly shaped behavior. And just mention this, it cannot be overstated how tech savvy this group is. They use things like Instagram, TikTok, and then YouTube. And I want to talk about YouTube for a second, because I think this is really interesting, right? Most of you know what Instagram and TikTok are. You obviously know what YouTube is, but YouTube plays a fundamentally different role for this generation compared to older generations. And it speaks a little bit to this digital divide, right? So older generations are using YouTube for things like how-to content, right? How do I fix my sink, right? How do I make a lasagna, right? How do I stretch out my lower back because we're all getting older, right? Things like that. And also repurpose professional content, right? Hey, show me the highlights of the Mets game last night. Show me the trailer for this upcoming movie. Show me that scene in that movie that I remember. Younger generations, in contrast, especially Gen Z, sort of think about YouTube as an extension of a social network, and are much more likely to make their own video, to use it as connections, to look for people their own age creating content, right? There's a lot of content that is not taken from somewhere else and put on YouTube, but it's made for YouTube first. And so things like get ready with me videos, which is usually for younger women, putting on their makeup and sort of telling a story about their life, ends up being enormously popular. Things like this is my morning routine that is easily filmed and shares what someone's actually doing in their life, or what I eat in a week to help people think about diet and nutrition. All this stuff ends up, you can go look on this, millions and tens of millions of views on many of this, which is not the same thing that older generations use YouTube for. In fact, when we look at this, we can compare Gen X to Gen Z, for instance. Half of what Gen Z is making is content creator produced, which is sort of an informal way of saying not quite professional level, right, of like fancy cameras and stuff like that. And meanwhile, Gen X is looking mostly at this professional content, right? It's sort of a different form of television, whereas for Gen Z, it's its own medium with its own type of creators. And there's a small note in this graph from Vivo and Publix Media that people of color are even more likely to prefer creator-produced content, right? And the ability to find stuff that really speaks to you and the life that you live is sort of native to this experience, where Gen X doesn't really view stuff the same way. Super interesting stuff. You can look at screen time by generation just to prove my point here. I mean, look at how big the gap is between silents and boomers, right? 2.9 hours a day. Now, some of these folks are retired, but still, Gen X 6 hours, Millennials 6.7, Gen Z 7.3 hours of screen time a day every day, right? So just enormous amounts here. And this, by the way, includes some folks who are in school, right? So that's your adult Gen Zers are spending even more screen time here. So pretty eye-opening across the board. you look at things like how often are we using our smartphones? This is the average unlocks. This is 2018, so all these numbers have gone up. But Gen Z considerably more than millennials, and it goes straight down as we get older, right? How often are we using this on a regular basis? All right, so that's a lot about millennials and Gen Z. I hope you found that interesting. We're going to dive in a little bit more to what that means for giving, right? So all that stuff is intellectually fascinating, but as we do our jobs, what are the insights that we can pull out of it to raise more money from this group, both now and in the future? So we look at, how high a priority are millennials for you? 15% say a very high priority, and then like a pretty high, but not most important high, is where most of us are at, right? In that 3 and 4 range. So that's really interesting, right? So, hey, we know we need to get better at this, but we're not there yet. Gen Z, we're not worried about it as much, right? So this all shifts a little bit to the left here. Not a super high priority for folks. And then what percentage of gifts come from millennials? Well, most people don't know, but for other organizations, pretty low, right? So what we're seeing here is it's a high priority, but we're not there yet. And so let's dive in a little bit more to feel like, how do we drive a little bit more of that giving from millennials across the board? What percentage of your total gifts come from Gen Z? Again, basically 0. And this is okay, right? These are young folks, historically very low charitable giving. As a percentage of all giving happens for people under 25. But we just want to know what to expect in the future when we think about Gen Z. So it's okay that most of this is pretty low. And I think it will stay that way. Obviously, that Oregon Trail generation of millennials is going to be a higher priority in the immediate sense. So a bunch of good news about the generation. 87% of millennial employees, give to charity. 70% give more than an hour to a charitable cause in terms of volunteering. Pretty exciting. Nearly 3/4 consider themselves a philanthropist, so their identity is that, compared to 35% of boomers. They also pay a lot of attention to what happens with the dollars they give, so they're very in tune with this. 2/3 track results for nonprofits they support, compared with only 1/3 of boomers. This is a really big deal, right? This is a real big shift in expectation and behavior. Gen Z follows suit, right? These are folks that were most likely to provide active assistance during pandemic. They're most likely to donate because they think it's the right thing to do. 60% have decided they want to make a difference in the world. Not sure what this other 40% are doing. And they prefer to stay in touch with nonprofits more than older generations, right? I mean, we talk about, sometimes we hear from nonprofits, they're worried about emailing more than twice a month. Now, remember, these folks are checking Instagram every single day, right? The level of content they're consuming is so high that it's unlikely that you're providing too much content to them in a way that older donors might think about that. Other things to note, when we think about channels, right? How are we giving? Well, you can see the silent generation, the oldest folks, the last generations to prefer direct mail. Boomers, more online than mail. Gen X is sort of the generation that killed direct mail to some degree, although it's still important. And in actually 2 weeks, we're going to do a deep dive on the future of direct mail, which should be really interesting. But you see how important online giving is here. And then you see with Gen Z, social media giving starts to come up. Now, important, right? If you think about where to focus here, if most of our money is going to come from boomers, Gen X, and millennials, then we got to really focus on that online giving. If we think Gen Z is going to be a big component, then we put a lot more focus on social media, right? So that's an interesting thing. Lisa asked, when does Gen Alpha start? It starts, I believe, in 2012, 2011, something like that. So good question. Again, we're going to talk about our older millennials. These are your key donors today, right? They're older, they're wealthier. And remember, when we talk about wealthy folks, there's really only 2 ways to get wealthy, right? There's some other, you can win the lottery, you can do some other stuff. But for the most part, either you're earning money through compensation and investments, or you're inheriting it, right? What we used to call the old-fashioned way of getting rich. These are really the 2 ways, and the Oregon Trail generation is really well positioned on both, right? So first on investments, they really have an investor mindset. Part of this is they're more financially educated than previous generations. And this really accelerated the movement, right? Especially those who were in higher paying tech jobs, who work remotely. Fastest growing segment of home buyers, and they make up 23% of all home buyers, only a little bit behind Gen X. And they saw this as a return on investment, right? This is the way they're thinking about homes in an interesting way. But also, as we think about this, right, they expect to buy a home in the suburbs. They're shifting there. And we're really looking for more space across the board as we look for home policies, right? They're buying homes, they're embarking on knockdown projects outside of major cities, which is really interesting. But back on the investment piece, they're really hands-on here, right? They're more likely to own stocks than other generations. They prefer investing hands-on in stock, in crypto, in donor-advised funds because of that real hands-on nature here. Digital tools like Robinhood and Schwab Online give them a control over their investments. And 40% of their millennials and Gen Zers check their investments every single day, right? I mean, it's wild here that the investment apps are not that far behind Instagram in terms of how often they check them. So donors are thinking, this is really important. We'll talk more about stocks in a second, but donors are thinking about this. And when the stock market's up, they're feeling good because they know it and they checked their investments yesterday, right? Really different than a lot of the very, very passive view of older donors. When we look at what they own, I mean, this is really important because crypto has been in the news a lot less, right? Why is that? My sense is that the folks who are tasked with writing about crypto have now been tasked by their editors of newspapers and magazines and online outlets with writing about AI. So there's a lot less news about crypto than there was 2 years ago. And yet, nearly 60% of Gen Z and millennials own crypto in some estimates, right? This is another view. You can see it's not quite that high, but you can see how crypto is primarily owned by that older millennial, younger millennial, older Gen Z cohort, right? This is where it's really centralized. When you look at things, you know, the rise of female ownership of crypto is going up. It tends to be owned by a more diverse set than traditional mutual funds. So that's pretty interesting. Mentioned before, millennials and Gen Z really give time to the causes they care about. Volunteer rate is 20% by Gen Z, 22% by millennials. They went through a competitive college admissions process. And so in many cases, they had to get involved to help their college applications look good. And not the only reason they did it, but it's certainly more pressure. And that built a habit that they continued on to later stages because their admissions processes were so much more competitive than previous generations. Gen X is the most charitable with their time, by the way, and they're raising Gen Z, right? So thanks Gen X for all of your volunteer time. Insight 4, we see incomes are really rising quickly here. So millennial donors are growing capacity much faster than older donors because they're on their way up here, right? Tech hiring remains competitive. It drives rising salaries. We're in, by far, the lowest unemployment in American history. And a lot of that competition is helping to drive wage growth for millennials. Things like big law, consulting, banking, they operate in what's called a tournament model, where at each stage, wages jump up pretty considerably. And so now your millennials that are hitting 38, 40, 42, these folks are starting to hit their peak earning years in an interesting way. And so a $10,000 gift from a millennial is actually a much more cause for celebration than a $10,000 gift from a boomer. Now, why is that, right? The reason is we can expect that someone who's giving $10,000 today and is 40 might be giving $20,000 in 3 years and $100,000 in 10 years. Whereas someone who's 72 and giving $10,000, they might be giving $10,000 again next year and $9,000 the year after that, right? So that's why these millennial major donors have to be cultivated, because they're on their way up. Let's dive in here. So Gen Z, obviously not all kids anymore. And actually the number of Gen Zers is starting to outnumber baby boomers in the workforce. 20% of the whole working population, which is really interesting. And they actively seek work opportunities that they believe are fairly compensated, right? So they're more aggressive in negotiations. And if you look at this, and this graph ends in 2020, so it really should go even higher. But you can see that the folks who are 35 to 44, right, that peak older millennial right now, they're making more money than anybody else has as a cohort when they were that age, right? So if you were 9, and this is real money, right? This isn't inflation adjusted. Sorry, this is inflation adjusted, right? So it's sort of raw purchasing power. And you see how much higher it is now And in 2023, it's even higher than it was at that peak in 2019. So pretty dramatic differences, right? Millennials are doing relatively well despite what you hear. The other thing that is really meaningful here, and this is the number one most important thing to remember from this whole session, is that millennials are the ones to inherit the great wealth transfer. So most of you know this, and it's the reason that we think plan giving is probably top priority at effective nonprofits over the next 5 years. Literally the number one thing to help you grow revenue. And what it is there's $70 trillion that is passed on as baby boomers age, right? 70 trillion, maybe even 80 trillion to some degree over the next 30 years. It's starting now. So I'm actually finishing an opinion piece now that we're writing for Nonprofit Pro. And one of the things is about how the great wealth transfer is really starting this year. And our friends over at the Susan G. Komen Foundation have told us that they're seeing that the highest rate of bequests realized, meaning people passing away and money coming in, that they've ever seen. And we're starting to hear that from other places as well, right? So plan giving over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years is enormously important. But remember that a lot of that money isn't going to charity, right? Most of it's not going to charity. Even if trillions of dollars is going to charity, most of it's going to kids or nieces and nephews. And most of those kids and nieces and nephews are millennials. And so millennials are going to have 5 times more money in 2030 than they had in 2021. I mean, part of this is, yeah, incomes are going up, but a lot of it is that boomers own more than half of all the wealth in the United States, and that stuff has to go somewhere when they pass away. It has to go, right? Hopefully a lot of it goes to charity, but a lot of it's going to these kids. And so it's not simply the case that some folks are going to be 10% wealthier, in 2030 than they were in 2025. Many of them will be 5 and 10 and 100 times wealthier. And this is a really big shift here. Remember, boomers had fewer children per parent, right? Fewer kids per family. And so inheritances are more concentrated, right? If you're a silent generation couple and you had 7 kids, well, you probably had less money because silent generation was less well off, and that got scattered 7 ways. If you're a boomer couple with 1 kid, 2 incomes, 1 kid, that money is getting funneled down to an even more intense way, right? 2 kids, right? Very few boomers had 7 kids the way that previous generations had. The good news, right? Historically, some of this wage growth has been concentrated in cities, although remote work is making that less meaningful. But the great wealth transfer is widely distributed, right? This is a look at millionaires across the United States. And you can see that with the exception of some of these very rural areas that are just also much lower population, right? 9% of the US households qualify as millionaires, and most of those millionaires are baby boomers. And that's all around the country. And all around the country that's going to get passed on to their kids and their family members. And so there's just enormous wealth shift, which is why we really have to get good at millennials soon, because that curve on wealth is about to go super hard and up and to the right. Okay, a couple other things, bonus insights. By the way, this is, I have to own this. This is not, I was looking for a picture of a bull for a roaring stock market. This is a yak, but it's a really beautiful picture. And so we're using it anyway. I'm just giving you some context there. The stock market run is really outstanding. We're not hearing enough about this in the news, but the S&P is up S&P 500 is up 17% year to date in 2023. NASDAQ is up 33%. I mean, this is a historically great year for the stock market. It's really outstanding performance. And I think generally the media underreports good economic news, but huge gains in the stock market. This is really important to talk about. Why is this happening? Well, investors are very bullish on artificial intelligence, right? They think it's going to really drive profits for a bunch of companies and create a lot more efficiencies. There's a persistently strong job market creating consumer demand, right? So consumers are still spending, even with higher interest rates. There's a belief that interest rates increases will decelerate and then reverse as inflation slows. And investors are just very big on how good the future is going to be. And now stock market giving has an enormous correlation with fundraising numbers. And you see this, right? 2022, not a great year. And it was one of the first years in a long time where fundraising actually went down. And you missed your goals in a lot of context, right? This should be a very good year. Now let's look a little bit more. Generally, it means people are willing to give more, but it means there's a lot more appreciated assets, right? So a lot more stock has gone up. a lot of folks have a ton of wealth in investments. So stock giving is going to be up in a big way this year compared to last year. The assets within donor advised funds, and as of the end of 2021, there's about $230 billion in there. Well, those assets are mostly invested in mutual funds. So if that $230 billion goes up by 17%, that's like an extra $40 billion in wealth created in the donor advised funds before anyone puts more money in, right? So huge gains there. And this should be a banner year for donor advised funds, which are already on the rise for a lot of reasons. Giving an IRA, right? So many of you have a lot of donors over 70. These retirement accounts are looking really good too. Why? Because retirement accounts tend to be mutual funds as well, right? So all these areas of non-cash giving go up. Also, crypto markets, which we talked a little bit about with these younger donors. Well, Ethereum and Bitcoin are the most donated coins. Ethereum is actually the most donated coin in the United States. It's also, by the way, close to carbon neutral, right? So a lot of the concerns about play out with Ethereum, and it's up 53%. So you have all these gains and all this wealth to be created. What's important here is that it's rapidly outpacing wage growth. It's a good year for wage growth, right? Wages are up about 4%, pretty good, right? It's a pretty good historical metric. But these assets are growing so much faster that we need to be asking for these assets in our giving because there's just a lot more of them, right? It's where the light is in terms of giving here. All right, so setting that aside, but wanted to highlight that because I think it's a story that gets missed, and it should be a really good end of year, but we need to make sure we're investing and doing this really well. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit more to tips and for how we're doing this. For finding, right? Let's say that you're a local social good organization in Pittsburgh, right? How do we find prospects? Well, one really good option is to look at Glassdoor, which many of you use for your own job searches. But let's look at salaries here and figure out where are the folks making a lot of money in our city. And oftentimes, because these people are on their way up in their career, let's look at salaries 1 and 2 levels up, right? So if you know someone's going to get a 30% pay bump next year, let's start having these conversations now. For technology, look at publicly traded companies, look at recent IPOs, although this is not as good a year for IPOs in technology and acquisitions, and you can do things like sign up for your local tech and startup newsletter to see where this is happening. So that's another little small tip. Second tip here is that donor advised funds are really exploding across the board, but the fastest growth in donor advised fund accounts is actually happening from millennials. So the compound growth rate of millennials joining donor advised funds is 30%, which basically means it's doubling every 2.25 years. I mean, that's sort of how the math works out. Still growing really fast elsewhere, right? Silent generation, 17%, boomers, 23%. So, if you don't have a plan on donor advised funds, you're missing out. But for millennials, this is just the fastest growing path of giving, right? And part of this is that many workplaces now offer DAFs as a benefit. So more and more young professionals are opening them and putting a portion of their paycheck directly into a DAF, right? So we really need to start thinking about how do we expand our reach in donor advised funds. And if you find a millennial with a donor advised fund who's interested in your organization, that's awesome, right? Because we know that they have enough wealth to open a donor advised fund, that they're charitably inclined enough to do so. And now they have this pool of money we can talk to them about year after year after year, right? So super, super important. A couple other thoughts here, right? So how are we going to do this? It's not that complicated. On our donate page, we need a link from my give from my donor advised funds. We need to have a checkbox if you have a survey, right? Or on your donate page, I have a DAF, I want to learn about giving more. Every survey you ask has to have a question. And then in your major donor conversations, just say things like, many of our supporters give out of donor advised funds. Would you like information about how other people are using their DAF for a bigger impact? Other things, our donate pages need to have this link, right? These are tech-savvy people. They're giving online all the time. 60% of people in Gen Z think that digital first impressions matter more even than in-person ones. And organizations who focus on non-cash gifts, we know grow 6 times faster, right? So for charities and for donors who are really focused on online giving and via email in particular, if you're emailing someone, linking them to a donate page, and then that doesn't have the other giving options, you're losing out on tons of money here. These people aren't going to call you, right? My sort of younger millennials and Gen Z on the call can tell you they hate calling strangers. And so if you don't have the information on your site, they're not going to call you to get it on how to give a stock gift or something else, right? So we're suggesting this on your donate page and in every single email. This is really, really important, right? If you need help, by the way, and many of you are in our really fun webinar on AI 2 weeks ago, we showed you a tool called Willy, which is at willy.freewill.com. It's a free AI tool for all sorts of content generation. But one thing it can do is help you write fundraising emails that includes this best practice, right? Which is really important, right? So you might not be sure how to do it. This can help you in literally a minute, right? What is pretty awesome tool. And then secondly, over the weekend in preparation for this, because I knew a lot of folks had trouble talking to major donors or other folks about switching from cash giving to asset giving or cash giving to QCDs, we built an additional tool as part of Willy, again, totally free, to help you create the sort of most compelling message. So what it does is you put a little bit of information in the about the donor, right? This is Max. He's 51. He lives in Wisconsin with his wife. They've been giving for 10 years. They like to support X. What's the most compelling message for Max about why he should move from cash giving to stock giving? And it will spit it out. And I've done it a bunch of times and it works really well. So go check that out. These are good for a one-to-one email or even talking points for a one-to-one meeting, but that should really help you. And what we see across the board is when we can shift people from cash to non-cash, their gifts go up pretty immediately, often by a factor of 10, right? So this should be a lifesaver in terms of hitting your goals. Okay, a couple other things. When we ask you how you're communicating with millennials, email, social media shows up. One thing that's a little bit less here is text messaging. We would encourage you to start sending more text messages. Talk about that in a second. For Gen Z, social media is even more important. Everything else is very similar. So good to see that. We're going to really want to meet these folks where they are, right? So they're spending a ton of time on their phones every day, online. We can treat communication and recognition for these groups differently than we do other folks. You can get more personal texts. You can find them on social media. This is totally fine. In fact, texts have nearly 100% open rates among these groups, and people tend to be very responsive here, right? 19% of this group says they never check voicemails, which I don't know how that happened, that voicemails became an imposition, but they are for this generation, and so it's not the way to reach them. When we look here at average time spent per day, again, TikTok and YouTube really show up, Twitter, et cetera, but pretty important. The other thing we're thinking about is, remember we talked about these folks are on the rise here, right? They're on the rise. And so we need to think about how to welcome them into philanthropy. So their giving capacity is going up year over year over year, and you want them to get involved and build these habits now. So for giving circles, right? Some of you have these recognition circles. What if we had a lower level to get in the same circle if you're 40 or 45 or 35, right? And what's going to happen here is that older donors are going to be so excited to have younger donors here, and they're going to give more. And younger donors are going to get in the habit of these larger gifts. They're going to get exposed to people and a peer group of people who are getting buildings named after them, right? Who are giving these much larger gifts. And most people haven't been exposed to philanthropy like that. And so you start to demonstrate what else is possible. And over time, these folks start to shift their behavior. And that's really important. So let's think like we're naming scholarships, right? Let's get the threshold lower for younger donors, welcome them in. And if we're doing these things, right, a scholarship, a park bench, whatever, can it be done with friends and not just spouses? Because so much of our philanthropy is built around, a couple giving together, but that's not the experience of a lot of millennials and Gen Zers, right? And so there's a really big opportunity here to open that, right? Have you considered doing this alongside a few friends? A little bonus tip here, we mentioned earlier the sort of shifting view that folks, that folks have on video. Remembering that these top 3 social media channels, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, are very video heavy. Even Instagram has really shifted into this, what they call reels, which are short videos for the most part. And younger donors see this non-professional video as common and compelling form of connection, not just broadcast, right? It's closer to social media than it is a television station. And so can you take a quick video of your work? Can you talk directly to camera? Can you try that this week? Post it on social media, send it directly in a text to some of your younger donors and see how it feels, right? This is a really important avenue because this is how people are used to getting messages. When you send only these great videos with the music in the background and sort of graphics, it just doesn't feel as natural to this group. And they just want to hear from you. Or if if you're in an animal shelter and you can take some really quick video, or if you're at a museum, you can walk, show a cool, talk about why you like this exhibit. Or if you're at a college, some quick filming of folks coming back to school. This stuff all really, really works for this generation. A couple more things before we wrap up. We're getting close to time. I'm actually going to go through the volunteer bit very quickly, but these volunteers are a really good way to build rapport with folks who are growing in their wealth, right? So it's a really interesting avenue. We want to keep them going. We're going to skip this because we're running low on time. Also important to show your impact. I'd encourage you to read about this as we go forward, but I'm not sure we have time here. The other thing I want to note is that planned giving, even from younger generations, tends to be quite useful. So 29% of the wills made on FreeWill are people in the Gen Z or millennial category, right? So 30%. These folks who are much more charitable, partly because they have many fewer children, and those things correlate together, right? The average gift value from a younger person is $30,000 because they're giving such a big chunk to charity. They're also more likely to share information. And what we're doing here is people aren't going to pass away in 5 years, and that's good, right? What it does mean is we're identifying high proclivity donors who we can steward, not just for their planned gift, but turn them into major donors year after year after year and really help fund the organization. So let's do that. So we have a few minutes. I want to talk about a couple quick things, and then I'm going to, we're going to take a couple of questions, but we may not have time to here. So my colleague Phoebe now is going to post a link to a very short story. Thank you, Phoebe, right on cue. Great work. And a couple things in that survey that'll be really helpful. One is if you want this book, which is an awesome book, make a quick note there. It takes you about 40 seconds to fill this out. And we'll send this to 15 folks as a gift. Secondly, on Thursday, so well, actually, this is tomorrow. I'm sorry. So it says Thursday. It's tomorrow at noon. We're going to talk about how to generate millions of dollars in October around National Estate Planning Awareness Week. So if you are interested in potentially learning more about FreeWill, and particularly how it plays into these key moments like Make a Will Month, which is right now, and what we call NEPA, which is August 9th, we're going to do a real deep dive on this on Thursday, about half an hour, pretty informal, but we'd love to have you, Wednesday. Let me apologize. This is Wednesday. It's tomorrow. It's at noon. I realize there are two different things on the slide. Noon Eastern. We'd love to have you there. If you RSVP in the survey, we will send you an invite. You're welcome to just eat your lunch during this time. Or you can also bring other folks from your organization. Really interesting stuff here and a way to really drive millions of dollars in a short amount of time, even for smaller organizations. So we'd love to have you there. A couple last things here. In 2 weeks, we are going to do a deep dive on the future of direct mail. Now, this is really interesting. Direct mail still drives a ton of behavior and giving. We're going to be joined by a special guest who is my dear friend, Josh Alcorn. Josh is totally brilliant. He co-runs something called the Nonprofit Storytelling Conference about how to create really compelling, amazing narratives that drive dollars, right? That drive real big gifts. And so if you don't want to come for me, come for Josh. It's going to be really informative and really exciting. That is 2 weeks from now. You can also just RSVP for that in the survey, I believe. Lastly, if you have any big ideas, big questions, just shoot me an email at Patrick@FreeWill. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm really easy to find. And with that, I think we'll pause. There was a lot of good questions, a lot of great input in the chat, but unfortunately it's about 1 o'clock Eastern, and I know that folks have other meetings, other things to do. So maybe just a quick closeout. Huge thank you for joining us on this journey through time and about these generations and how they're shaping. We know it's so important to your career and the future of your organization. So glad you're here for it. We love getting to put these on, and so just really grateful for y'all being here and spending an hour with us. Would love to see you tomorrow if you have time. If not, no problem. But your choice, but it's a big, exciting opportunity to learn there too. And hopefully my voice will be a little bit better in 24 hours. So I'd love to see you tomorrow. Connect with me on LinkedIn if you have any questions or email, but big thank you again to Phoebe, who put on a lot of work here, and hope you have a wonderful week.